Good morning. If you will, be turning in your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5. You know, I spent 18 years working in construction, and many of you know that. And there was one thing that I never actually heard a homeowner or a customer say, and I'll kind of walk us through a scenario so that you can see what I'm talking about. But say that me and my crew were to show up on a job site, and we get there and we begin immediately to unroll our cords. We get our hoses out, we get our tools out, we have the material down on the job, we're getting everything ready to start. And say the homeowner comes out and they say, "Hey, I would like to have a word with you. I want you to understand what we expect out of this build." So we walk aside, of course, we have a conversation, and this homeowner says this: "I want you to make sure that you build us something that looks amazing on the outside. I want you to make sure that you build us something that has curb appeal, that when people come by and they see it, they just stand and they look and they're just amazed. But as it pertains to any kind of structural integrity, don't worry about that. You see, we don't really care if it withstands time. We don't care if it withstands the weather. We don't care if it has any kind of backbone to the structure. We just want it to look real pretty on the outside." I never heard that, right? That would be silly. As a matter of fact, if a homeowner ever said that to me, I don't know exactly how I would respond. First, I might laugh a little bit. I might chuckle. And if they look at me blank, staring at me in the face with a blank face, and I realize that that's what they really want, well, I might have to tell them, "Look, you hired the wrong people. You're going to have to get somebody else. I can't do that." It would be foolish. It would be silly. You know, I wonder, think about what makes up the home. Think about the individuals, the family that makes up that home. And given that same thought, I wonder how often it is the case that maybe we have that kind of mindset about our home, our family, that we're just worried or concerned about a physical appearance. But we're really not putting in the effort to look to God's Word and find out how I am to fulfill my God-given role and responsibility within that home. Just having that curb appeal. Just having that look of something that is wonderful, but yet having no backbone, no structure whatsoever. You know, in Psalm 127 and verse 1, it says, "Unless the Lord builds a house, they labor in vain who build it." You see, if He is not at the foundation of our homes and how we structure our families, we're laboring in vain in trying to build up a godly home because He's not in the picture. Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 3 and 4 says, "Through wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches." You see, by turning our attention to what God's expectation is for the husband, for the wife, for the children, through His wisdom that is supplied through His Word, we come to an understanding with the knowledge of how to raise up a strong, structurally strong home. I want us to look at a few things, key ingredients, key materials, if you will, on building a strong home. Look there to Ephesians chapter 5, and let's start at verses 22 through 24. Verse 22 starts, it says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands, as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church, and He is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything." You see, building stronger homes means that our homes need to be submissive homes. Strong homes are submissive homes. Now, when you think about this, we need to understand that when someone comes to a text like this, especially with a worldly mindset, today's society has very much made submission look like it is something horrible. They made it look very wrong. They've made it look like something that is not pleasing. And we need to make sure that we understand that when you come to a text like this, there are two things that we must do, that we must be willing to do. Number one, we must be willing to put aside any kind of worldly definition of what submission actually is. Take the worldly perspective of what God wants out of wives in this submissive role that He has given them. What the world thinks about that, remove it from your mind. You see, it's not weakness. It's not a character flaw. It's not something that is displeasing to God, but as a matter of fact, even as Johnny just read in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 18, wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting to the Lord. This is what is pleasing to God. And it's important to understand that submitting does not equal inferiority. It's not saying that this person in the household is any less than anybody else in the household. It does not show a position of inferiority. Let me ask you a question. Was Christ inferior because he submitted wholeheartedly to the will of the Father? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, when you look at Christ and how he was submitting completely to the will of the Father, you see a number of things. You see strength. You see humility. You see meekness. We see every great characteristic of God displayed through Jesus' self-sacrifice, not inferiority. We see something powerful. We see something amazing. We see something praiseworthy. We see something glorious. You see, we need to remove any kind of worldly perception of what submission is and understand what biblical submission is. The second thing you need to understand when it comes to a text like this that we need to be willing to do is that we read this text for what it says and add nothing else to it. You see, when you look at these three verses, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 24, in these verses there is submission, yes, that is recognized within the text. There is also this headship that is recognized within the text. But this text does not give the husband permission to physically enforce submission, to demand and bark orders to bring about submission. You see, headship does not equal dictatorship. And we'll get to the husband's role in a minute. But it's to love, not to rule over. And the wife is to submit. Husbands are not to subdue their wives and rule over them with an iron fist. That's not what we're talking about. We need to understand biblical submission for what it is. It could be described as this: willingly yielding to another. Willingly yielding to another. You see, the wife is to willingly yield to the leadership of the husband. That's her God-given role and responsibility. And this is instruction that we need to be teaching our daughters as they raise up and they mature into young ladies. They need to understand that this is a God-given role, a blessed role as the wife, as a submissive wife. You think about when Paul wrote even to Titus and the instruction that was given for the older ladies. Titus chapter 2, verses 4 through 5. What did he tell him? Here's the instruction. He says that they admonish, speaking to the older women, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands and to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. By how she conducts herself within her own household can blaspheme God. If she is not fulfilling her God-given role and responsibility, it can blaspheme God. And he says, look, instruct the young ladies so that they understand this blessed role that they have. Help them to understand the importance of fulfilling this role as a submissive wife. Think about 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1. It says, wives likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. Do you hear the power that's within that? That even a man who is not obeying the word might just turn and obey the word because of the conduct of his wife. Look, many know it, and it's no secret that I was not the one who brought our family to Christ. It was my wife and my children who led first, who turned their lives in trying to follow Christ. I see that. I recognize that they're doing right, though I was hard-headed for a very long time. I followed their lead for a moment because she was willing to do as she was supposed to do. There's great value in that. You see, Paul, by inspiration, he likens the marital relationship to Christ and the church. Now, if you think about what he said in verse 21, he also throws in there, leading into this, he says, submitting to one another in the fear of God. So we have to recognize that there is this mutual submission that takes place while at the same time there is this position of headship, one who has that authority in the home. Well, think about Christ and how he attained this headship, Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 22, because he first submitted to the will of God. If you look at Matthew chapter 26, verse 39 and verse 41, he says, not as I will, but as you will. Your will be done. You see, Christ was willing to submit himself to the best interest of the church in this servant-type relationship that cost him his life. And in return, we submit ourselves to Christ in honoring his headship and trusting in his guidance. You see, we submit ourselves to him because he submitted himself to God and the church in the highest form. Now, you take that imagery of Christ and the church as the standard, and the church submitting to Christ. If a wife sees her husband as head in the way that Christ is head of the church, then she sees someone who is not going to put his own interest first, but put her interest first. She sees someone who is willing to provide for her, to protect her, to care for her, and to serve her. If you go back to 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, there's an example given there that shows the appreciation and the respect that the wife is to have for the husband. Verse 5 starts, it says, for in this manner in former times the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed, calling him Lord. Now look, husbands, I'm not giving you the permission to go home and tell your wife that she has to call you Lord in any means. What I am saying is there was this show of respect that Sarah had for Abraham. She trusted in his leadership. She saw him as someone who was going to provide for, care for, and she was willing to yield to him and to submit to him. To what extent does that go? If you go back to Ephesians chapter 5 and look again at verse 24, it says, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. In every aspect of life. So long as your husband is not trying to lead you into sin, you are to submit your will, your desires, and your interest to him. Now, go back to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1 and think this through. You see, because it's nice and it's great when you look at it in the sense that the husband is fulfilling his role in every aspect. But if you take it back to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1 and look at the scenario, you have a husband who is not fulfilling his role. Yet the wife is still being submissive to the husband. You see, when the husband may at some times not lead the best, when he may not love you as you think that he should love you, he may act like a total clod at times. It's still your responsibility to submit to your husband. It does not give the opportunity to slander him, to tear him down, to make a public mockery of him. You still yield as a Christian woman, submitting to your husband. You show your devotion in your service to God and how you show your devotion in service to your husband. You honor and affirm his headship and help him carry it through. That's the responsibility of the wife in the home in this submissive relationship. Building stronger homes means that wives are willing to submit to their husbands, to be there to support him, to help him carry through his leadership. Now, husbands, let's look at our responsibility. Continue there in the text. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25 and following. We'll read through verse 33. Husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of the water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourished and cherished it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husbands. Strong homes are loving homes. The imagery that Paul continues here with is Christ and his church. And what Paul is now going to write by inspiration to the husbands is, if you are going to walk worthy in your role as the spiritual leader within this house, you are going to love your wife as Christ loved the church. Now, when you come to a text like this, remember what we said before. Read it for what it says. Yes, we just came out of a section, verses 22 through 24, where it says, wives, submit to your husbands. You do not then go into verse 25 and it says, husbands, rule over like a dictator to your wives. But it says, love your wives. Husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave his life for her. Do you feel the weight of that command? Do you feel the weight of that instruction to love your wife as Christ loved the church? Think about what Christ did for the church in expressing his love toward his own bride to the church. You see, Christ forfeited his interest. Christ forfeited his own desires. He forfeited his own will for what was best for her. To whose benefit was it that he left the glories of heaven? To whose benefit was it that he was mocked and ridiculed and beaten? To whose benefit was it that he went to the cross? You see, the picture here for the husbands is that you give yourself completely to your wife to provide for, to nurture, to care for, and to love her. Now, if you tie that thought back to the previous verses 22 through 24, then you realize this position of headship does not give permission to boss her around, demanding obedience and forcing submission, but rather loving her as Christ loved the church. Well, what does that look like in action? How do we show that kind of love? The same love Christ showed toward his church. How do we execute and show that kind of love toward our wives? Well, it has to be a selfless love. It has to be a selfless love. Christ did not put aside his own desires and leave the glories of heaven because he did not love his church. He showed his selflessness in the fact that he was willing to leave the glories of heaven and come and to give his life for his bride. You see, he put the needs of his bride first. He expressed his own selfless love toward his bride when he said this, "For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many," Mark chapter 10 and verse 45. You see, when a man marries, his decisions are no longer based solely upon what he wants and what he desires out of this life. But it should be that the welfare of his wife is at the heart of every decision that he makes. That's loving our wives as Christ loved the church. That's selfless love. But it's also sacrificial. It has to be a sacrificial love. John chapter 15 and verse 13, it says, "Greater love has no man than this, to lay down his life for his friends." What did Christ do for his bride? He laid his life down. He sacrificed his life. A husband that is willing to love his wife sacrificially says this, "Nothing is so precious that I cannot give it up for my bride." There are all kinds of things that we can fill our time with. There are all kinds of things that can distract us from our God-given responsibility as a spiritual leader of the home to love our wives. There are so many things that can distract us of that. I can burn up all my free time in going to the golf course and going to my favorite fishing hole and going to the woods and doing all kinds of other things, and I would fail at my responsibility to love sacrificially my wife. I have to be willing to put her first and put everything else to the back burner. Loving sacrificially. But it's also a sanctifying love. Look again at verses 26 and 27. It is a sanctifying love, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she should be holy and without blemish. Verse 26 as well, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word. Now, if you think about what Paul's saying in this description, again, playing off of this illustration of Christ and his church, his bride, what is it that he's saying that Christ actually did? What he's saying is that Christ purified and spiritually beautified his bride. Husbands are to sanctify their wives in the way that they lead them, in the way that they teach them, in the way that they protect them spiritually. You see, a husband who is truly loving his wife in this sanctifying love, he will never put her in a position that is compromising. He will never do anything to defile her. And he will never expose her to anything that will bring about impurities to her life. Too often it is the case that marriage and life is looked at as the pursuit of happiness. The reality is marriage is the pursuit of holiness. We need to make sure that we are striving together to bring about holiness in our lives. And the happiness, it comes along with it. But holiness needs to be at the front of our minds. It is a sanctifying love. It's also a satisfying love. Look at verses 28 and 29 again. It is a satisfying love. It says, so husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourished and cherished it, just as the Lord does the church. Now think about what a man's going to do for his own needs. Think about what he's going to do for his own body. He's going to satisfy his own body's needs. If I get hungry, look, I'm going to find food. If I am thirsty, I'm going to find something to drink. If I'm tired, I'm going to take a nap, hopefully. If I get injured, I'm going to treat that wound. If I'm ill, I'm going to take some medicine, right? I'm going to try and get myself better. Well, if you think about it in a broader sense, in a bigger picture, the husband then is to anticipate and meet his wife's needs. That's a satisfying love, trying to help her along the way and be there for her, to supply for her, to meet her needs. It is a satisfying love. And one of the most important, I would say second to the holiness, it is a supreme love. Look again at verse 31. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. In a supreme love extended from a husband to a wife, a man's marriage ought to come before every other earthly tie that he has. That relationship is to be first and foremost, number one in this physical life. The relationship between a husband and a wife is compared to Christ and his church, the highest of all spiritual relationships found. We need to appreciate that marital relationship for just that, being compared to something as beautiful and as glorious as that. You see, the highest form of human bond is not the relationship between a mother and a child. The highest of human bonds is the relationship between a husband and a wife. And if we understand that, and we know that, and we appreciate that, we will extend that kind of love, like Christ loving his bride. We will extend that kind of love toward our wives, putting them first in our lives. And everything else will follow suit. That's how we are to love our wives. Now let's shift gears on this just a little bit. If we are not teaching and preparing our sons for the great responsibility as spiritual leader in the home, we are failing them. We are failing them miserably if we are not teaching them this kind of love, the love of Christ that was extended toward His bride. Because they are not going to look out into this world and find that kind of love. They're not going to find those who are showing this kind of love of the world. They're going to be of Christ. They are definitely not going to look to social media and find any kind of love that is compared to this right here. It is our responsibility to teach them, to train them, to show them by modeling godly homes what this actually looks like. Now, let's close with this thought on husbands. Just as I stated, as it pertains to the wives. Remember, the husband might not always do his role. He might not always fulfill his role, and that does not give her right then to slander him, to speak evil of him, to act hateful toward him. Just the same, husbands. It may be the case that your wife is not submitting like she is supposed to submit, but it does not give you the right to be bitter, to be hateful, to be demanding. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 19 says, "Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter toward them." If one person is failing in their God-given role and responsibility, look, they will answer for that. It is not your place to be judged. It is your place to continue to love your wife as Christ loved the church. And just the same for the wife. It is her place to submit to her husband in her God-given role as a wife. And we need to teach our children about these roles so that they understand that these are from God, that these are a blessing, that these are what build up and nurture strong homes. All right, to the children. Being I burned up 25 of my minutes, we don't have long. Look at chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it will be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord. Strong homes are obedient homes. Now, when you come into this text, it is very important that you pick up two key things. You see, when Paul writes this, he says two things. He says children are to obey and children are to honor their parents. And it's important that you catch that because it is possible to obey your parents without honoring them. Some may be obedient only out of fear of what consequence may come if they're not obedient, but it does not mean that they are honoring them. However, it is impossible to give parents the honor that is due without obeying them. Obedience is submission, but honor is respect that motivates that obedience. You see, obedience and honor toward parents is not only good for the parents within that household, it is also good for the children within that household, but it is also good for society around us. If these virtues are not practiced and taught in the home, why on earth should we assume that they would be practiced in schools, that they would be practiced at work, or that they would be practiced in the church? It is our responsibility to train our kids up, as he stated, in the admonition of the Lord. That's our responsibility. So here's 4 things. We'll close with these 4 things. 4 ways we as parents can help instill this type of behavior, this type of obedience and honor within our children. Number 1, stand as a united front. If our children see us as the leaders of the house, if they see us being divisive between us, the husband and the wife, where the wife says, look, Dad said you can't do this, but hey, I'll pull you aside, we'll go shopping, just don't tell Dad about it, you're undermining that authority. We have to stand as a united front in that house. Same to the dads. If mom says no to the children, guess what? We stand together on that decision. And we lead them and we guide them and we show them this united front without any type of divisiveness between the husband and the wife. Because if we show them that, you better believe they'll start to feed off that, and they'll start to use that against us. Number 2, lead by example. Lead by example. If you look there at Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 1, it says, therefore be imitators of God as dear children. And note then the closing statement found in the section for the husbands there in verse 33. It says, nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. If we as husbands are not extending that kind of love toward our wives, what do we expect our sons to grow up and do? If you as wives are not extending that kind of submission to your husband, what do you expect your daughters to do? If we're not leading by example and showing that kind of Christ-like love in our homes, what do we expect them to do? We should not expect them to do any different than what we show them ourselves. We have to lead by example and show them a godly home in the way that we treat them and the way that we treat each other. Third, exercising discipline. Exercising discipline. It is so important. You know, me and my dad were talking just Friday night. And he actually brought this story up, and it was kind of funny because it actually was in my sermon for an illustration today. We used to live right down here at Little Creek Park. And me and a friend of mine, Jeremy Pamplin, we were young. We got up, it was raining outside, it was raining pretty heavy, and we thought, hey, we can go out and we can play in the rain. So we worked our way over to Little Creek Park, and we found one of those great big culverts that water was just rushing through. And we found out that we could jump down in the water and we could shoot through it like it was one of those tunnel slides at McDonald's. We had a blast for about 30 minutes. We shoot out the other end, and I hear Dad calling, oh man. We poke our heads up out of that little ditch, and we see him coming, and he grabs both of us and he jerks us up out of that water, and we're headed back to the house across the football field area or soccer field of Little Creek Park. And Jeremy's looking over at me, and he's like, he's not going to whoop me, is he? I tell you what, he wore us both out. He tore us up. You know what the text says, Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 24? He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines promptly. With haste. They need to understand when they do wrong. They need to be disciplined when they do wrong. Nowadays, you know how difficult this can be? You can discipline your child within your own house. Somebody else hear about it and call CPS on you. Guess what? Leave the paddle hanging on the wall and let them know, yes, this is a house that brings about discipline because it's what's right. It's what's good. It's what's needed. Fourth, love them. The same kind of love that we extend to our spouse. Extend that kind of love to your children. Be part of their life. Know what's going on in their life. Talk to them about it. Help them in their daily walk. Give them instruction. Give them guidance. Hear them. Listen to them in their struggles. Have that kind of relationship with them and love them. And that's how we help bring them up so that they are loving and honoring their parents. When it comes to building stronger homes, we cannot be satisfied with merely a wonderful outward appearance. We cannot be satisfied with people walking by and just taking a glance and saying, hey, that looks like a wonderful family. We need to be more concerned about the spiritual home and how it's made up and everybody fulfilling their God-given role and responsibility in building a stronger home. Here's the thing. We get so caught up sometimes in everything else, in our work, in our fun and play, that we fail and we neglect our spouse, that we fail and we neglect our children. Look, if you find yourself in that situation, recognize the wrong. Communicate with your spouse and say, look, yes, I want to do better. I want you to help me to do better. Communicate with your children. But most importantly, communicate with God. If you're failing in that area, or if you've been lacking in that area at all, take the opportunity today to recognize that wrong and begin making that wrong right. If you have need today as it pertains to the home, in fulfilling your role, let us know. We'll pray with you. We'll wrap our arms around you. We'll give you that encouragement for the week to come. Anything that you might need as it pertains to spiritual matters, please let it be known as together we stand and as we sing.